Hello everyone and welcome back to another reaction. Today we're continuing on with the Unbiased History of Rome by Dovahhatty. This is part 10 and this is about the mad emperors of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. So without further ado, let's get going.
I was born 75 years ago. For 40 years I have ruled as Rome's emperor.
The greatest Roman emperor.
But for all these years, I have never been the ruler of my own wife. I have seen the borders of Germania, beyond which no civilized eye may see. Behold, in chaos, a barbarian sweeps the future.
Oh god. Communism. The specter of Nazism.
This is the 19th of August, the year of Romulus, 767. These are the closing decades of the Julio-Claudian dynasty and the final seconds of my life.
An epic intro as usual from Dovahhatty.
Augustus was dead. Having been secretly poisoned by his wife, his remaining relatives mourned him, as she made the preparations for Tiberius' ascension as emperor.
Yeah, and I talked about this last time, but I don't really buy any of the stories about Livia being behind every single poisoning of Augustus's children, or rather his adopted children and heirs. And I don't buy that he was poisoned either. So yeah, but you know, Roman sources are generally biased, heavily biased against women, and look down upon them as some sort of scheming kind. But yeah, but of course this is just my biased view. We are listening to the unbiased history here.
That of course included having Posthumus executed, and later having Tiberius show up to the Senate, where he was proclaimed the new princeps. He refused most titles and responsibilities they gave him, but as he would find out, the senators were men fit to be slaves. With Tiberius now the emperor, he was faced with revolting legions demanding more pay in Pannonia.
Tiberius, the successor of Augustus, he continued to follow in Augustus's footsteps in many ways, adopting the Principate system, in which he formally renounced titles and offices, but in practice retained most power in Rome. And, well, Tiberius is quite a complicated character. He has a good start to his reign, but as things will go, it goes pretty bad at the end there.
To settle that, he sent his son Drusus the Younger, alongside the Praetorian prefect, Sejanus, both of whom hated each other. But then the legions in the Rhine...
Ah yes, Sejanus. We will be talking a lot about him, I imagine.
also mutinied, so Tiberius sent Germanicus to them. Seeking to live up to his father and avenge the betrayal at Teutoburg, Germanicus calmed the mutineers through his endless charisma, paying their salaries out of his own pocket, and promising that anything they looted in their hunt for Arminius would be theirs to keep. Germanicus then crossed the Rhine with his legions, ransacking the Germans in a righteous punitive campaign, taking Arminius' wife as prisoner and recovering the 19th Legion's Eagle Standard.
Germanicus is the heir to Tiberius at this point, in accordance with Augustus's wishes. Augustus wished Germanicus to be the successor of Tiberius, and so when Tiberius came to power, he followed his wishes and adopted Germanicus as his son and heir. And he's a very, very capable general and would have probably made a great emperor. But continuing in the Augustan curse, it will not be.
He then slaughtered his way into the Teutoburg forest, witnessing the purest essence of Germanic barbarity. Desecrated bodies, guts spilled over trees, remains of live sacrificial burnings, chaotic evil at its worst. He had his men bury the dead and honor their memory, only then returning to the campaign.
Oh, that's interesting. If you've ever watched HBO's Rome, you would recognize the name here. Gaius Varenus, one of the main characters, son of Polo formation, a reference from the first episode, and Marcus Pullo, son of Titus Pullo. And yeah, HBO's Rome is a great series, recommended to all fans of Rome to watch. Even though it only has 2 seasons and it's quite rushed at points, still a great series.
Enraged, he attacked the Cherusci heartland, crushing Armenians at the Battle of the Weser River, and then honoring Tiberius by building a mount with the Germanic weapons captured, which triggered Arminius so much that he attacked again, and again Germanicus crushed him, then building an even bigger mount, honoring Tiberius, Mars, Jupiter, and Augustus. Germanicus then sailed back to Gaul through the North Sea, getting suddenly struck by a storm conjured by Neptune. But not only did Germanicus survive, but he personally rescued hundreds of soldiers by dragging them into the coast. And to end the campaign in good taste, he again raided Germania, annihilating the Marsi tribe and recovering yet another eagle standard. If you still don't love the guy, allow me to quote Tacitus. Germanicus did not want any prisoners, as the extermination of the Germanic tribes was the only conclusion he saw for the war. Fucking based.
Tacitus is, of course, one of the more famous Roman historians of the empire. And this quote is, well, I'm not sure if it's verbatim, but I'm sure it was something like that. You know, maybe worded a bit more kindly, perhaps.
Oh, and Arminius? Backstabbed by his own tribesmen.
Of course.
A treacherous death for a treacherous germ. As Germanicus returned to Rome to celebrate his triumph, he was followed by his wife, Agrippina the Elder, together with his 5.5 children, among them Gaius Julius Caesar, named after his great-great-great-great-uncle, dressed by his mother with a pair of small soldier boots, forever gaining him the name.
Keeping track of all the names of the children of this era is almost a hopeless task, because they're named the same, and the only thing that distinguishes them, sometimes they're called Drusus and then Drusus the Younger, or Agrippina and Agrippina the Younger. That's the only way to distinguish them, and it's frankly not very helpful anyways.
Nickname: Caligula.
Caligula.
Also, Claudius, Caligula's uncle, had just recently married to a woman that would later cuck him. Such was life for Uncle Claudius. The only other one not having a good time was Livia, whom feared that Germanicus' popularity would eventually allow him to overthrow Tiberius, even though he was extremely loyal. But hey, since when has that stopped Livia before? And so she began bitching at Tiberius to have Germanicus withdrawn from the Rhine legions. And to shut her up, Tiberius gave his nephew command over the eastern half of the empire, which was even worse, so Livia sent her servant, Gnaeus Piso, along with him, just to make his life a living hell. He would cancel his orders, counter his opinions, unmake his reforms, and not even when visiting the ruins of Troy was he safe from his bullshit. So Germanicus departed to Egypt to get away from Piso, which Livia took as the last straw. And so, having also partaken of the divine Julian semen, she used her own black magic to conjure a poison for Piso, who then put it in Germanicus' food. Before long, Germanicus fell deathly ill, and died in front of his family, striking his wife with as much sorrow as it did anger. She immediately filed for Piso to be prosecuted for murder, thinking that Tiberius was behind this. The Senate happily obliged, condemning Piso to death, and before he could snitch on Livia, she hastened his execution. And just as things were getting bloody, Claudius asked Tiberius to let him start the cursus honorum, but Livia made him forbid it. He had once tried writing a history of the civil wars, and it really put Livia in a bad light, so she kept making his life miserable. The reality was, Tiberius was trapped between his mother's dictatorship and the Senate's incompetency, so he began relying on Sejanus more and more, whom used this to further his ambition to one day become emperor.
Yeah, so Tiberius' early reign was marked by stability and a continuation. Even though he had none of Augustus's brilliance, he continued on with the administration of the empire, when things were, going generally well. Um, but yeah, as time goes on, Tiberius seems to become more and more of a paranoid character and very distrustful of the Senate, which, I mean, it's the Senate, so that's fair, I guess. But yeah, he will start to rely more on his praetorian prefect, Sejanus, and Sejanus will, in effect, become the de facto emperor during the latter stages of Tiberius's reign, while Tiberius is apparently off on an island having orgies with children. The stories vary, but we should keep in mind here that the sources of the emperors of the Julio-Claudian dynasty are very biased against them, making them out to be perhaps a bit more mad than they actually were. But nonetheless, it's clear that besides Augustus, there weren't really that many successful emperors of this line. Perhaps Claudius would be considered one of the more competent ones, at least.
And with the new heir, Drusus, hating him so much, Sejanus seduced his wife, Livilla, to conspire together with him. Convinced, Livilla had her husband poisoned, and with his death, Sejanus asked Tiberius to marry Livilla. Easy to say Tiberius refused. So Sejanus settled with pressuring Claudius to marry his relative, Aelia, whom would endlessly physically abuse him. Such was life for Uncle Claudius. Tiberius then considered Claudius as his new heir, but he backed off fearing Sejanus' wrath. Struck with grief and endless paperwork, Tiberius let Sejanus bear almost all tasks of state, secluding himself to the island of Capri, while Livia and Sejanus used his authority to either expel or execute anyone they wanted. Livia made sure to kill as many innocents as possible before her time came, secretly advising Sejanus to get rid of Agrippina and her children for Tiberius' sake.
Livia, the great mastermind of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the one to kill them all.
Which he heeded for his own sake. One night, as the imperial family had dinner, Tiberius offered Agrippina some fruit, but she viciously refused, suspecting poison. Sejanus then used this as an excuse to accuse Agrippina of misbehavior, and her eldest son Nero of sexual degeneracy, banishing them both, and later her other son Drusus as well. The three of them will later be either beaten to death, starved to death, or in Agrippina's case, both. And since we're talking violence, some Jew with god delusions just got crucified in Judea. From here on, his followers would increasingly infest the empire with their sacrilege against the divine Caesars and overall Christ cuckery. There's something to all this, but that's for way later.
Yes, and it's about this time that, Christianity comes into being, and it will be a huge issue for many emperors and years to come, where Christianity will become this focus of intense persecution by the Romans, at least initially, only to then to become the state religion of the empire. A curious turn of events, but that's for another time.
And now, with most of his family now dead, Caligula and his sisters were invited to join Tiberius in Capri, alongside Gemellus, Drusus' son with Livilla, whom Tiberius wished to have co-rule the empire with him, later marrying Caligula's sisters off one by one, and later him to a girl named Junia, whom died in childbirth, so whatever. Caligula blamed Tiberius for his relatives' deaths, but whenever he prepared to stab him in his sleep, the ghost of Augustus would appear, and discourage him from such a dishonorable act. Back in Rome, Sejanus had become so powerful he was the de facto emperor. He had his enemies, or anyone really, executed without end, had his birthday celebrated as if he was part of the imperial family, and even schemed with Livilla to ally with the surviving Julians and overthrow Tiberius, making him the regent of both Gemellus and Caligula.
Yes, so Sejanus was really starting to, through various family ties, creating family ties, all that, setting him up for a position where he would be officially declared emperor after Tiberius and, acting as regent and maybe starting his own dynasty, who knows, but it was not to be.
Whom he would later betray. But even Tiberius had his limits. He might not care how many senators Sejanus kills, but threatening him and his heirs was enough. Sejanus was then called onto the Senate, where he was denounced and tried guilty of treason, with his lover Livilla being ousted as well. Sejanus would be strangled to death, and Livilla imprisoned by her mother Antonia, whom had her starved to death. But Tiberius' lack of will to rule the empire was indeed troublesome. So one night, as he slept, Caligula gently had him suffocated with his own bed sheets, at the bold age of 77, a far more graceful way to kill an emperor. And with his great uncle now dead, Caligula was acclaimed the new emperor, later denying Gemellus of his inheritance. That kid had gone insane over the years.
Yeah, Caligula, when he came to power, he quickly did away with with his co-ruler Gemellus, and seized ultimate power for himself. Unfortunately for Caligula, this was about the only, decent thing he did for himself or the country. Or the empire, rather.
And Caligula knew the last thing Rome needed right now was a madman as emperor, later having the crazy kid executed. His grandma Antonia literally killed herself over this, but oh well. Caligula was then received into Rome, cheered by the crowds as the son of the great Germanicus, leading to over 160,000 animals being sacrificed in his honor. During the first few months of his reign, he threw all of Sejanus' old treason trial documents into the fire, pardoned countless exiles and prisoners, reduced taxes to unprecedented lows, upped the soldiers' pay dramatically, and threw several games and parties in honor of his dead family members, whose remains he had recalled to Rome, and buried alongside Augustus in his mausoleum. By then, his uncle Claudius had just finished the history.
Yeah, Caligula quickly spent the entire Roman treasury that Augustus and Tiberius had accumulated by having all of these lavish parties and games and all the other stuff he just mentioned. So that's quite a feat, because the Roman treasury at this point should have been pretty big. But yeah, Caligula won't last long.
History of the Etruscans and Carthaginians, so Caligula celebrated it by making him consul with him, mixing him up into crazy cults that costed a fortune, all for the sake of banter. But as he worked his way into the hearts of every Roman, Caligula was struck with a devastating illness. Forced into his bed, he suffered immensely, after having prophetic visions of the future and losing consciousness. When he finally woke up, Caligula had realized the truth. He had become a god. Embracing his duty to act as a god, Caligula started a harem around his own sisters, especially Drusilla, whom he treated in all ways as his wife, despite the fact that she was married to the great-grandnephew of Lepidus. To match his divine status, the gods inflicted on Drusilla the same illness that afflicted Caligula, but she couldn't survive the divination process. In order to channel his grief and anger in a constructive manner, Caligula followed on his father's steps and marched his legions beyond the Rhine. There he would crush only one Germanic horde. All in all, his father's previous campaigns had really devastated the area, thank the gods, so instead, he set his eyes on Britannia. But to successfully invade, he would have to face Neptune, the god whose ocean storms had greatly troubled both Caesar and his father's campaigns.
Not only Caesar and his father's campaigns, but, so many Roman armies have been lost at sea throughout history. It's kind of astonishing how much bad luck the Romans had at sea. And of course, some of it had to do with their own incompetence regarding seamanship and ignoring the obvious signs that storms were coming and all that, but still, Neptune was a fearsome enemy of Romans.
Standing god to god, Caligula confronted Neptune on a one-on-one combat for the fate of Britannia. The writings detailing this divine conflict have been lost to time. All we know was that after a long struggle, Caligula had emerged victorious, and
yes, of
Neptune's
course,
precious seashells as victory spoils. Having taken too much damage, Caligula postponed the invasion of Britannia. Good thing too, as he just then learned that his friend Lepidus had been plotting against him, all while banging both of his sisters Agrippina the Younger and Julia Livilla. Ashamed at being related to such adulterers, he banished them both, then had Lepidus killed. Later returning to attend a wedding hosted by Gaius Piso, whose wife he took a liking to, so he took her right then and there, openly telling Piso what felt like taking her virginity. Then he grew bored and divorced her the next day, doing her a favor and forbidding her from marrying Piso.
Yeah, now obviously it's a bit exaggerated here, but there was quite a lot of family drama during the Julio-Claudian dynasty. They were so focused on this internal drama that the rest of the empire was left neglected. Now, the institutions that Augustus had set up was so good that even though we had this string of bad emperors, the empire continued on prospering, run by the professional bureaucrats. And there really wasn't a need of strong leadership from the top at this time. But as time will go on, the empire will face external challenges that will require strong leadership. And that's where we will see that the system starts to crack a bit, and then even more. And we all know what happened to Rome, so let's not get into that. That's just depressing.
That guy was trouble and everyone knew it. Caligula then experimented by marrying Lollia, but he wasn't into that pedo stuff. So, as a god of divine taste, Caligula married a big-titted MILF named Caesonia, whom he showed openly naked to his friends, casually threatened to kill, and conceived a child with her, named after his late sister. He then came to understand his true nature as a new god, a new Jupiter, and yes, as Neo's Helios, the new sun. Then starting to cut off the heads of statues and substitute them with his own, ordering many temples to be built in his honor, and in time began to treat the disgusting mortals he was surrounded with as they deserved. As Caligula traveled in his carriage, he forced the senators to run alongside him, punishing those who couldn't keep up. Once, as he watched the gladiatorial matches and they ran out of gladiators, he used his powers to throw an entire section of the pleb audience into the arena to be eaten by the lions, so he wouldn't get bored. Whenever he needed money, he sent agents to rich citizens' houses to be executed and their property confiscated, never bothering to come up with some faggot-ass excuse to justify his divine whim.
Yeah, the Romans at this point had had a long history of, how should we call it, forcible asset seizure. That's one way of putting it, whereby you come up with some excuse to kill a rich senator or whatever, seize his property for the state, to fund wars or whatever you needed money for.
As he watched his prisoners being tortured and screamed for mercy, he would have their tongues cut off to enjoy the execution in peace, telling the torturers to make them feel like they're dying. One day, he had the entire Roman fleet aligning in a tight single-file formation alongside the Portus Iulius Bay, crossing it on horseback just to prove Tiberius' old astrologer wrong. One night, as he received the client king of Mauritania for dinner, he suddenly realized the whole concept of client kings was gay, so he had him killed, and his kingdom annexed into the empire.
Now this is a trend we will see going forward, whereby Rome will now annex their client states. Previously, Rome had created all of these client states and client kings, to outsource the defense of the empire's frontiers. But now we're starting to see more direct integration and turning in these former client kingdoms into proper provinces of the empire, which brought both good and bad consequences.
Later sending the legate Paulinus to crush any provincial revolts there, something he would become an expert on. And once the Jews started complaining at Caligula's statues being placed in their synagogues, he ordered that a statue of himself be placed on the Temple of Jerusalem itself, renaming it as Temple of Illustrious Gaius, the new Jupiter. As he returned his attention to the Senate, seeing the sheer stupidity and incompetence the senators displayed, for the good of Rome, Caligula appointed his horse as consul, who proved to be smarter than the whole Senate put together.
Yeah, this is perhaps the most infamous, most infamous part, that if you ask anyone if they know anything about Caligula, the fact that he made his consul a horse, rather made a horse a consul, that's probably what they would know. But yeah, like I said, the sources on the reigns of especially Caligula and Nero are quite heavily biased against them, and so there may have been one or two slight exaggerations about what exactly they did during their supposed madness.
And with Rome now in his horse's capable hoofs, Caligula prepared to move to Alexandria, where he hoped to further understand his divinity. But just as his unrivaled banters and godly virtues made him popular with the plebs, so had he driven his enemies to the edge of envy and resentment. They were revolted by the existence of someone so divine, even more so one whom they owed their souls to. Unable to bear the thought of Caligula returning to Rome more powerful once more, a conspiracy was born, led by a senator named Cassius, with Carrera being his last name, Cassius Carrera. The thing with Carrera was that, as a Praetorian guard, he couldn't stand being a constant target for jokes, being the feminine-voiced, balls-chopped manlet that he was. So one day, as Caligula addressed some actors during a festival in honor of Augustus, Carrera and 2 others ganged up on him, stabbing him to death.
The first of many Roman emperors' death at the hands of the Praetorian Guard. And this is a very unfortunate institution that Augustus created. The Praetorian Guard worked when the emperor was strong. Oh well, it usually did what it was supposed to do, that is to guard the imperial family and serve as the empire's most elite unit. However, when we get these strings of bad Roman emperors, most of them will get offed by the Praetorian Guard.
You could say that he lived up to his name right to the end, and beyond it as well. But killing the God Emperor, as far as that is possible, wasn't enough. No, he had to invade the Imperial Palace and kill every single member of the Imperial family he could find, including Caesonia and their infant child, whom he had thrown at the wall and its skull crushed. Such is the wrath of ugly feminine incels. But as the loyal elements in the Praetorian Guard showed up, they eventually found Claudius hiding from Carrera behind a curtain. Then they all turned to him and proclaimed him their new emperor.
I think there's a very famous painting of it, showing Caligula hiding behind the curtains, fully terrified by this murderous rampage. But the Praetorian Guard just declared him as emperor, and he was kind of stuck with the job from that point.
With the Senate, he graciously pardoned all conspirators, except Carrera, who he had executed. So yeah, Claudius is emperor now. Funny that. You wouldn't expect someone whom Livia had raised by an abusive ex-mule driver to end up anywhere in life, but here we are. Knowing that his best strategy would be to imitate Augustus as much as possible, Claudius renamed himself after the original princeps, which would become common practice. To start off in a good light.
Yeah. From here on out, the titles of all future Roman emperors included the title Augustus, or the name Augustus too. But in time, it would become the name would become synonymous with the title of a Roman emperor. And later on, when there were multiple emperors, like under Diocletian's tetrarchy, Augustus would denote a senior emperor, and a Caesar would denote a junior emperor. Now it's the title Caesar that actually gets used more later down the line in history, like the German word Kaiser or the Russian word Tsar comes from Caesar.
He exempted the ruins of Troy from taxation and affirmed the rights of Jews to... Let's hope that works out. He also built a ton of shit. Aqueducts, roads, the works. One of his big projects was to try and drain the Fucine Lake, but the drainage pipe backed up and submerged the entire effort. A humiliating affair, but such was life for Uncle Claudius. Claudius then assumed the office of censor alongside Lucius Vitellius, the father of Aulus Vitellius, a really fat cunt, remember that, using his office to purge all of his enemies from the Senate. And yeah, Claudius had enemies. Mostly senators as blasted at how he had welcomed even more civilized Gauls into the Senate than Caesar once did, killing some 35 senators and 300 equestrians in total. It's no real purge, but hey, it's a start. To help him rule, Claudius had some freedmen as advisors, among them Narcissus, his most trusted subordinate, with whom he sought to consolidate the empire. That is, annexing as many Clyde kingdoms as possible, among them Thrace. There, now we can call it Mare Nostrum. And to exploit the fact Caligula had cleared the way of Neptune, Claudius set his eyes on Britannia. As it happens, one of the Briton-client tribes Julius Caesar had set up had its king deposed, so Claudius sent 4 legions there to reassert Roman influence. The path cleared, Claudius arrived with war elephants, founding Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester, as the new capital of the province. Among Claudius's legates was a one named Vespasian, whose swift...
Ah yes, Vespasian. A name to keep in mind for the upcoming videos. or upcoming video rather.
Conquest of the western British coast would gain him much fame. Victorious, Claudius personally pardoned one of the defeated Briton tribe leaders, Germanicus, permitting him to live in Rome, where he would become so civilized he questioned why the Romans ever bothered conquering the mud hut from his homeland in the first place. Claudius then had a new son, naming him Britannicus, whom he sired with his third wife Messalina. And man, if you think Julia the Elder was a whore, Messalina was a nymphomaniac through and through. She fucked all men she could manage to hide from Claudius, born high and low. She once personally challenged the greatest prostitute in Rome for getting fucked by the most dicks in one night, and she won effortlessly. But besides being a degenerate adulterer, she was also a cruel hypocrite. For once she saw Claudius was welcoming Caligula's sisters back from exile, she had one of them, Julia Livilla, exiled and later killed for sleeping around with Seneca. Yes, the Seneca.
The Seneca. A very important Roman poet, if I remember correctly. He had many jobs, you know. I think being a poet is his main occupation. And if it's the Seneca I'm thinking of, yeah. It's an important figure in Roman history. Not for the statesmanship or anything like that, but, you know, for Rome's cultural history.
But that still left Agrippina around, together with her son Lucius, a descendant of Antonia Major. Remember her? The other baby Octavia was holding? Yeah, details. But despite her mother's and grandmother's efforts, Agrippina took much more after Livia, from whom she learned all about how a Roman viper should get ahead in life. So to restore her previous status and wealth, she tried to seduce the governor of Hispania, a one named Galba.
Oh no, not Galba.
He was blunt like that. Nevertheless, Messalina was getting real jelly at the popularity the Julians had with the people, and since Claudius would never have them disposed of, she came up with her own plan. First, she would wait until Claudius got out of Rome. Then she would marry one of her lovers in plain daylight with hundreds of witnesses, and then have Claudius killed and have her husband take over the empire. Somehow, astounded at her stupidity, Narcissus contacted Claudius, telling him of the whole thing. And while the emperor hesitated to punish her, Narcissus just sent the Praetorian guards to make her kill herself. But Messalina, being a woman, really sucked at suicide, so the guards stabbed her to death. Claudius now
That's
had to
one way
choose
of doing
his
it.
fourth wife, and given his options, he chose to marry his niece Agrippina, thus reuniting the Julian and Claudian houses. And after endless requests by Agrippina, Claudius disowned his son Britannicus in favor of Lucius, whom, as his new heir, would have his name changed to Nero.
Oh, no.
I love this part. And to ensure his future ascension, Agrippina had all of Messalina's old allies who might support Britannicus over Nero exiled, even killing Britannicus' tutor after he started to criticize his abandonment. And finally clashing with Narcissus, whom favored Britannicus over Nero, having him exiled to Campania. As his new heir, Claudius had Nero marry his daughter Claudia Octavia, and then recalled Seneca to serve as his tutor. But in time, Claudius began to regret his decision. For his whole life, he had been the target of jokes and manipulation by those around him. But no more. He wouldn't let his wife manipulate him for her own purposes anymore.
Yeah, Claudius was, from the very moment he ascended to the imperial purple, nobody expected much of Claudius, but he defied expectations, and even though historians have generally seen Claudius as a rather bad emperor, modern historians have begun to rethink about Claudius's reign, and in fact it kind of was not that bad actually, even though, you know, he had a really bad relationship with the Senate, but who cares about the Senate at this point, really? Glorified aristocrats, really. Claudius was probably more capable than Tiberius, actually, and yeah, I know it's not a great bar or whatever, but still. Claudius did fairly well, given his circumstances and all.
He would have his biological son be the heir, and there was not truly a disciple of Livia we have here. Agrippina then had Narcissus imprisoned and killed, later introducing her new emperor of a teenager to the Senate. But if what Agrippina intended was to make her son a puppet of her means, then she was beyond delusional. Even as just a 16-year-old, Nero lived up to his Julian bloodline, asserting his rule over others. Firstly by scorning his marriage to that flat-chested Claudia, then by openly fucking a freed woman just to show that he could, then simply ignoring everything his mother told him, letting his wise advisors like Seneca do the talking. Left out in the cold, Agrippina sought to betray her own son. and so started shooting for Britannicus to be seen as the rightful heir to Claudius. I'm not making this up. She actually went to Nero one day and outright confessed she had killed Claudius to make him emperor, and threatened to snitch to the Praetorian Guard and make them acclaim Britannicus as the rightful emperor. And so, just to spite her, Nero had Britannicus poisoned in front of his sister Claudia, then banished Agrippina for being such a cunt, but that would prove not to be enough. Nero tried to get Agrippina poisoned 3 times, but she was even more resistant than Mithridates. He once tried to collapse the city on top of her,
That Eastern
but she
black
got away
magic.
just in time. Then he tried sinking the ship she was in, only for her to swim to safety to the nearest island. So Nero, having run out of patience, just had a guard stab her to death. It worked, true, but he would forever be haunted by her angry spirit. But in the big picture, Nero's regime would be tested right away in the first...
And if you noticed, we haven't focused much at all on what is happening in terms of politics in Rome, what's happening in terms of foreign policy. And that's because, it was pretty stable. Not much really happened. There were the occasional raids into Germania, Sassanids, or rather the Parthians at this point. They made some rumblings, but, overall the situation in the Roman Empire was pretty good. So, hence the great focus on the internal family drama here, which, frankly, is quite confusing, even to someone who knows a bit about this period. It's very hard to follow all of the plots and intrigues. But let's see what's going on here with Parthia.
year, with the Parthian king invading Armenia once again and installing his brother as king. To answer this aggression, Nero sent the general Corbulo to the east, whom, thanks to Parthia being overrun by rebels, proceeded to obliterate all enemies he found and retaking Armenia.
So Armenia, for the longest time, served as the buffer state between the Roman Empire and the Parthian and later Sassanid empires. And Armenia was very often contested between these two powers. And, at various points it was a Roman client state, and at various points it was a Parthian Sassanid client state. At various times Armenia was split in two. So, Armenia had the very unfortunate geographical position to be stuck between two of the greatest empires the world has ever known. And this would only continue to be the case in the centuries to come.
He then returned to Rome to celebrate a triumph, leaving his armies to his legate Pietus, whom was then defeated and badly humiliated by the Parthians. Analyzing the situation, and frankly not caring much about the Armenian shithole anyway, Nero allowed the Parthians to pick the Armenian king, but first he would be forced to suck the Roman emperor's cock for approval, some payback for Pietus. Back to his private life, Nero finally resolved to divorce the infertile Claudia, later having her killed. He then married one of his mistresses, Poppaea, whom had just divorced his friend Otho, so he made him governor of Lusitania as compensation, so he would fuck off somewhere far away. Poppaea would then bear him a child, but it was a girl, named Claudia no less.
Oh no.
She didn't survive infancy. But as far as ruling the empire went, Nero was of one mind with Claudius and Caligula, so he had a client kingdom of Bosphorus directly annexed into the empire. Later, Paulinus would be elected to govern the province of Britannia, accompanied by his Gallo-Roman disciple, Agricola. So yes, back to that god-forsaken island. Ever since Claudius'
the Roman conquest of Britannia is an interesting foreign policy expansion here. Britannia, frankly, it was not worth conquering. Sorry, but that's just the truth. There really wasn't any resources or to be had. There were no developed urban centers before the Romans came. Not really. Which it was similar to Gaul in that respect. It was really tribal. But Romans need conquests. Ever more conquests.
invasion, subsequent governors had extended its borders north, thus subjugating the Iceni, whose deceased king had willed its land to both his daughters and the Emperor Nero. The Romans then came to collect their inheritance, and after seeing just how badly polluted the British gene pool was, the Romans saw as their duty to impregnate as many women as possible with their virile Roman seed, so that future generations wouldn't suffer as much. But denied the privilege was the Iceni queen, Boudica, whom couldn't cope with her daughters getting all the fun. Enraged and beyond jelly, Boudica rallied the local tribes to revolt against.
Yeah, Boudica's revolt is perhaps the most famous chapter in the Romano-Britannic history. And it was quite the rebellion, and led by a woman, which was pretty much unheard of. But, you know, the might of Rome always wins in the end.
The Romans, being elected their warrior queen, and setting off to destroy the civilization the Romans had brought with them. By then, Paulinus was governing the province and conducting a campaign in Wales. But when he received news from the east, he called on one of his legates to join up with him. But the fucker just refused, cowering away from the revolt. Deprived of reinforcement, Paulinus was forced to make do with the overall 10k men he could muster, against the 230k Britons under Boudica. With a rage to rival Dido, Boudica razed every city she got to, including Camuledunum, Verulanium, and Londinium, with Paulinus rescuing as many civilized refugees as he could. As he was pursued north, Paulinus halted the march, sending the refugees ahead, and choosing to die fighting. After withstanding the Briton hordes for hours, Paulinus, the absolute madman, had his men form up into several wedge formations and charging at the Britons, killing tens of thousands of barbarians in a non-stop bloodbath. Even completely surrounded, Paulinus crushed all resistance. Terrified, the Britons began
Absolute
to flee,
mad lad.
riding up in their carriages like the retards they were. And
yeah, these carriage tactics was pretty common by these tribal confederations. They used carriages as some sort of makeshift rampart, really, and it was quite good defensively. But you know, the Romans, they have a ways of getting past everything.
Loading, getting themselves all slaughtered. At the end of the day, 80,000 barbarians lay dead at
Jesus.
Paulinus' feet, having lost only 400 men, and later making Boudica kill herself. After the battle,
Perhaps slightly exaggerated numbers.
Paulinus would engage in such a vicious punitive campaign that Nero had to transfer him away from Britannia, leaving Britannia in his disciples' hands. So let's see how Rome's doing right now. And it's burned badly everywhere.
Literally this time.
Their best to put out the fires, but after calming it a bit after 6 days, it reignited and burned for another 3. As the flames raged, 2/3 of the Eternal City lay in ruins, countless killed, and many more displaced and homeless. Once Nero heard of this strategy, he diverted most of his own personal fortunes to assist the survivors, but that didn't save him from the slanderous accusations. Once the fires
That's true, actually. There is this story that has been festering in the public consciousness, and it's almost a saying at this point that Nero was off playing his little instrument while Rome was burning. He was playing his violin, or whatever it was, how the saying goes. But in actuality, Nero, and it's also said that Nero started the Great Fire of Rome. But Nero was, first of all, he was not in Rome at the time of the fire, so he could not have personally started it, even though he might have ordered it, but that doesn't seem likely either. And when he heard of the fire, he actually rushed back to Rome to direct the firefighting efforts. And after the fire, he implemented reforms to make sure that this great fire would not repeat itself, widening the streets, making sure that houses were built, and fire-resistant materials, and all that fun. But Nero is probably the most slandered emperor in Roman history. And, well, even though he was not a great emperor by any stretch of the imagination, he was a terrible emperor. No doubt about that. But still, there needs to be some reason, needs to be some rethinking, and that's what modern scholars have done, is to reassess Nero's reign. It was not quite that bad, and Nero, by all accounts, was quite popular with the plebs. So, he couldn't have been all that bad, but still, overall, terrible emperor.
Finally calmed down, Nero was left wondering, just who could have started the fire? Who could have killed countless thousands for their own aims? Who could have put the capital of pagan civilization to the torch?
Yes.
Who could have... It was the fucking
Who could it
Christians,
be?
Ever since the end of Tiberius' reign, that Eastern cult began spreading like a virus through the empire, dissuading the plebs from the ways of Jupiter and the divine Caesars with their monotheism. Such blasphemy was beyond the pale for Nero. He would do everything in his power to save Rome from the Christ-cuck menace. Starting the first persecution of the Christians, Nero chose to fight fire with fire, having the Christians crucified and then burned alive, using them as torches for his parties at night and as decorative posts for his gladiatorial games by day, throwing even more Christians into the arena, letting them be eaten alive by the lions. During his persecutions,
Nero started the first great persecution of the Christians, a trend that would be followed by many, many emperors to come.
Would have St. Peter killed, and instigating such fear in the hearts of his victims, a millennia of butthurt Christ-cuck writers would come up with every possible childish slander they could think up about him.
Yeah, and this is the case with many Roman emperors in the history about them. They were written by Christian scholars who had a beef, a legitimate beef, I would say, with these emperors, and they came up with all sorts of slander that unfortunately stuck in the public mind. Even to this day, there are many myths and lies about Caligula, Nero, that are being treated as fact when there is very little support for these accusations levied by Christian sources. But that's just how history goes. History is written by the victor, it is said, and this is sort of part of that.
And thus, the first revisionist historians were born. So many Christian parasites Nero would have killed that he would forever be acclaimed as the Antichrist, given the number 666, gotten from the summation of his name when translated to Jewish numbers. And while torturing Christians is fun and all, Nero was far more athletically minded, holding periodic Olympic Games for contests in chariot racing, singing, and acting, winning every single competition, every single time.
Amazing! Nero must have been an extremely talented man. Or not. It's a well-known fact that Nero enjoyed the Olympics. He also enjoyed winning the Olympics, and surely a Roman emperor couldn't arrange for a bit of rigging. Surely not.
He was also architecturally gifted, erecting a giant 120-feet colossus of himself at the heart of Rome. He would proudly stand there overlooking the city, until I don't want to talk about it. Such was Nero's skill and dedication to the Olympic Games he held, his wife wouldn't stop berating at him for spending so much time on them. One day, as she wouldn't stop screaming, he kicked her pregnant belly in a fit of anger, killing both her and his unborn child. But even then, she still didn't shut the fuck up. And despite being such a great emperor, Nero, just like every other emperor, would be the target of a conspiracy, masterminded by Gaius Piso. I fucking told you he was trouble. Delusionally seeing himself as a more worthy ruler, Piso started to gather support for a coup with broad support among the Senate, equestrians, and yes, the Praetorian Guard,
course,
growing more corrupt by the day. But it would all go down the drain thanks to a freed woman, as she tried to enlist an officer into the plot, but he stayed loyal to the emperor, and then ousted the conspiracy to him, testified by a senator named Nerva. Nero would then have the freed woman
Nerva, the first of the 5 good emperors in the future.
Tortured, Piso executed, and Seneca, having been an accomplice on the whole thing, was forcefully suicided. His works on Stoicism would still be respected though. By whom? Well, let us say that Nerva is but one of a very distinct group.
Yes, indeed.
To calm himself down, Nero had a friend of his kill himself so he could marry his wife, but she didn't prove to be enough. So Nero, as a man of patrician taste, he also married one of his twink servants, named Sporus, dressing him in emperor's clothes, putting makeup on him, and best of all, having him castrated. It's not like he would use anything.
Yeah, this is very famous Sporus. Apparently Nero liked young boys, and Sporus was the most famous one of a famous lover of his. And all around a bit of a creepy story.
But his boy pussy anyways, he wasn't a faggot. But as they celebrated their honeymoon, Nero received word of trouble brewing in Judea. So okay, what are the Jews up to now? As always, it all came down to shekels, as Nero's high taxation was triggering the Semites to no end, and as they refused to pay up, the Roman governor of the province was forced to break into the Second Temple and take all of the withheld tax revenue. Their great temple desecrated, and above all their shekels taken, the Jews threw a great revolt,
Oh god.
slaughtering all Romans they could find, and ambushing an entire
Yeah, before the great persecutions of the Christians, there was many persecutions of the Jews. And this will continue until Hadrian puts it all to bed for the final time.
legion to its death. To deal with the Jews, Nero sent Vespasian east, alongside his eldest son Titus. But the Jews weren't the only ones complaining about taxation, among them being a Gallic governor named Vindex, whom also revolted against Nero. Not for his own sake though, but in the name of Galba, then governor of Hispania Tarraconensis. With such treason in display, Nero sent the legate Verginius to crush Vindex's revolt. His men then proclaimed him the emperor, but Verginius refused, staying loyal to a fault.
Now that is unheard of in Roman history almost. We will see a trend where the legions will start to declare emperors more and more without authorization of the Senate or whatever. And most of the time, these generals would accept the title of Augustus. Someone refusing that honor and staying loyal to the legitimate government. Oh, that's a novelty.
Such loyalty wasn't shared by Nero's Praetorian Guard, whom proclaimed for Galba and then abandoned him during the night. Left all alone, Nero contemplated suicide, but with his wife by his side, Nero chose to persist. As they fled to Ostia, seeking to exile themselves somewhere far away, the sailors also betrayed him, denying their service. Nero then contemplated his options and chose to flee to a friend's Italian villa. There, they would have them dig up a grave for him, lamenting how the world would be deprived of his majestic artistic talent, crying out the name of his lifelong love, Sporus. It didn't take long until the news of the Senate's betrayal arrived, whom proclaimed him a public enemy. As he heard the cavalry's approach, Nero refused to let his glorious dynasty end in such disgrace. As the soldiers arrived, they found the emperor bleeding to death on the floor. Some Praetorians had remained loyal and tried to drag him out, saving him from death, but Nero dismissed their attempts, whispering, "Too late. This is fidelity." The dynasty is shattered. Nero is dead. With the Senate and the Praetorian Guard, they have sealed the lineage of divine Caesars forever. The last of the Julio-Claudians passes now into history. Nero goes gladly, for he knows his death is not in vain. He takes his place with his great-uncle and his great-uncle's uncle. The early principate has ended. When the next dynasty rises, you shall be its witness. The shape of the future, the fate of the empire. These things now belong to me. Ciao, ciao.
Yes, that was the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and from this point onwards, that line, that family, will go into the history books, and they will never rise to any prominent position in the empire ever again. And so it ends the direct lineage to the great Emperor Augustus, and by extension Julius Caesar. A watershed moment in Roman history, marking the end of the early Principate and the beginning of the next phase of the Roman Empire. But there's still much more glory to be had before we get into full depression mode here. So yeah, thank you for watching this video with me. There was a lot of internal family drama that I frankly didn't want to comment on, because we would drag on this video forever. We've already had, this video is already pretty long, so yeah. Anyways, thank you for joining me, and I'll see you guys next time.